Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And yes, I'm here again. There's no break yet. There's another 3 days of shows. Then you've got none of me for 4 days while we celebrate Christmas or whatever festival you want to celebrate. But I've been really looking forward to this show. I contacted our guest. It was quite a few months ago, and waiting for the right opportunity to bring her in and talk about this subject because it's just so different. We've done lots of shows where we've had people talking about a battlefield from above ground, walking across fields, looking at hills, looking at elevation. But today we're talking about underwater archaeology. My guest, Dr. Jennifer McKinnon, is an archaeologist who's been part of and led dives on a host of historic sites around the world. But she's joining us today to talk about her work on Saipan, although we may delve into other subjects as well. I can't wait to bring her in. So good afternoon, Jen. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Well, I mean, it's just you're about the coolest person I've had on for months. I mean, to go to dive on wrecks off these places of historical interest is fantastic. So before we get into the ins and outs of what you do when you're there, how the hell did you get into this? I mean, did you always want to go underwater with your archaeology, or was it something that an opportunity came your way?
No, actually, I knew I always wanted to be an archaeologist, and then I was finishing up my undergraduate degree, and my parents were divers, and they had the idea of getting me certified to dive. And I met some underwater archaeologists and figured out that I could actually do archaeology underwater. And so that was kind of the end of it for me. Once I decided that that was the case, they got me certified, and I liked diving. I went to graduate school for my master's and PhD, and that's the end of it. So still here doing it.
And obviously we'll find out during the talk what it is you can learn from going underwater. I think the people watching this and lots of tour guides. David O'Keefe is watching from Canada. You can walk across battlefields with a compass, and you can work out, as I said in the intro, their elevations and distances and topography and terrain. But the underwater aspect to me is a complete mystery. Other than, I mean, you've sent me this amazing footage, which will start playing soon, of oh my God, there's an aircraft. Oh my God, there's an engine. But I'll be intrigued to know what it is you're learning down there. But let's start with some of your PDF PowerPoint images, because we're talking about the Saipan, and so let's take us through why did you go there? How did you get a chance to go there? How did it all come about? And what was the purpose of these dives?
Yeah, so I moved out to Australia and started teaching at Flinders University. And when I got out there, I knew I needed to have some research closer to where I was, because I'm originally from Florida in the US. And I was interested in Spanish colonial shipwrecks because I cut my teeth on Spanish shipwrecks in the Florida Keys, did a lot of work on those. And so I wanted to go out to the Mariana Islands because that was a stopping point for the Spanish for the Manila galleon trade. And so I flew out to do what I thought would be Spanish colonial shipwrecks. And when I got there, I was amazed by all the stuff in the water that was related to World War II and that history. And the community kind of guided me towards that because they knew I had experience with developing underwater heritage trails in Florida. And so they wanted to develop an underwater heritage trail. So we ended up applying for a grant, and that was the first of, dozens of grants that I have now gotten to study and research and help preserve and conserve the sites underwater in the Mariana Islands. So I've primarily worked on Saipan, although I've done work on Tinian and Guam. Those are the three sort of most populated, also Rota. But the Saipan has been a large, area for me of focus.
And so I'll put up the map of we talked about Operation Forager a few months ago on the channel, and we've tackled the Mariana Islands in various ways and shape and formats in the past. But you went there. You're aware there are these underwater wrecks. So how does the process begin? Of you've obviously got to get the equipment to go out there and dive at it. But what are you looking for? Do you know what you're going to be looking for till you go down there? Do you have a methodology of how you can interpret these wrecks and what information you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just like on land, the underwater, portion is a landscape itself. And so, whenever we go out there and we're looking for sites, we're usually using magnetometers or side scan sonar to, find sites. So in 2008, some friends of mine who were working for a private company were hired by the island to do a sonar and mag survey. And that was about the time that I was heading out there too. And so it was very fortuitous that I was able to use the data that they collected. And so we just started diving on targets, magnetometer and side scan sonar targets. There's over 1,000 targets just within the lagoon of Saipan, not even outside, because that area had been surveyed. And one of these sites, like the Aichi Jake, was one that was known by divers and locally snorkeled and dive. It's in 15 feet of water. And so we talked a lot to the dive shots as well. What sites do you know? So we use mag, side scan. We talked to a lot of community members, divers, dive shops, and we jumped on a lot of targets to find what we could find. And some of these sites are already very well known. This one, the Emily, is a Japanese bomber, and it has two monuments on it, a Japanese monument and a Korean monument, because the Koreans were used as conscripted labor during World War II. And so these are the kinds of sites that are already known, but we were starting to sort of piece together some more of that history by developing them into a maritime heritage trail. So we worked for a couple years. I had graduate students out there and other, professionals that did maritime archaeology. And we surveyed all of these sites, created site plans, and there's 9 sites in all that you can go and dive on. This TBM Avenger is super cool. It's upside down on a coral reef. Its landing gear is still out, and we think we actually know which one this is. The pilot survived, and the 2 other aviators did not. So this one's pretty cool, although it is slightly dangerous. There is a rocket in the wheel well, and then what we think is a 500-pound bomb that's underneath the engine. That's a further distance away. We didn't find those until after we placed it, on the trail, but I have spent a lot of time on that site and literally laid on that rocket a couple times collecting data. So I think it's probably okay. But yeah, these are the kinds of sites. It's crystal clear water. I mean, the sites, range from something you can snorkel on to something, up to 30 feet. And these are all in the lagoon. This is a PBM Mariner. It's a US plane. It's upside down, so you can see that sort of black space under there. It had a dihedral wing shape, and that's how we identified it, along with some of the gun turrets. And there's cool sharks that hang out under there, little reef sharks and stuff like that. So when we go down, I usually try and be the first one in the water, because once we go down with all our bubbles and equipment and all that kind of stuff, they scatter.
We've got a good question that I think is worth addressing right in the early part from David O'Keefe there about the wrecks. How easy is it to tell whether they're from the battle or are they dumping pits? Because we get that in Normandy. I always bring up Normandy, that's where I live, where there are tank parks where people just dump. Well, the Allies dumped the various knocked out German tanks. So it's not where the vehicle was knocked out; it's where it ended up. So it might be on its side, it might be there. So when you're looking at these, and JD, who was in Saipan himself earlier this year, is amazed that there are 1,000 identifiable sites there, because he'd heard of the 3 Shermans there. So how do you ascertain whether that what you're looking at is a dump or a battle relic?
So that's exactly like, one of your first questions was, what can we learn, about doing underwater archaeology? And I think that that's one of the areas in which we can contribute the most. So some are, shot down in action, others are dumped. With the US, there's this process of discard, of salvage, so cutting up these wrecks. So as an example, I'll just give you one example. that we have a little Jake that's, you know, in 15 feet of water. It is a Japanese float plane, so it would have been operating around there. And whenever we mapped it, we noticed it had bullet holes in the tail, and then it was with a bunch of other non-related materials. It also had a crimped area in the tail, like somebody had wrapped a chain around it. And so we know from the aircraft in Broome, Australia, that the US would take like Tomahawks and knock holes in it, because when you dump a plane, the engine is the heaviest part. So it'll go down, air gets trapped in the tail, you knock a few holes or punch a few holes in it, you know, and it sinks to the bottom. So those are the kind of like little clues that we look at whenever we're mapping the sites to tell us about that history. This one is super cool. This will tell that story as well. This is an LVT-A4, which was one of the landing vehicles that they used in the invasion. Okay, so this one we mapped over a couple weeks. I had a graduate student, Sean Arnold, who did a really good job. He took out calipers and measured the metal and mapped every bit of it. And what we found out was this was discarded, because you could go through the discard manual and look where charges were supposed to be set on this vessel, and you could swim over to that area and look, and you could see where it had been exploded. So we could tell that this was a dump. This had been discharged and dumped where it was at, or, you know, it wasn't functioning and then it was further, you know, sort of discharged. The other thing we noticed on this was there's boilerplate on the front. So these are in-field battle modifications. So it's an extra thick bow. And so the soldiers would put that on to get over the reef, because the reef could puncture the metal. They also put some boilerplate up around where the gunner was, because it didn't have a shield. And that, as you can imagine, was pretty problematic. And they added another 30 cal to it. So we found out all these really cool details by studying this site that speak to, you know, the soldiers trying to basically prolong the life of themselves and their vehicles, and you know, adjust to new environments in which they're fighting, because they had to go over the reef. And then this model, called the LVT-A4, those modifications made it back to the production line, and they made the next version that went into the subsequent Pacific battles, and it was known as the Marianas model. So that's super cool, you know, when you can find basically the prototype of those in-field battle modifications on sites that can tell you about that kind of history of use and how that, you know, fits into the production of the model over the Pacific War.
Brilliant. And by the way, folks, we're going to be playing the video soon. We're just doing the slightly less exciting still images first, and the video will come up later, which Jen can then talk over. But people are fascinated about the whole subject. Another question I think is worth addressing straight away is the issue of if you find human remains at all, and if you do, what the process is, what the procedure is.
Yeah, so the first thing we do is we contact the Historic Preservation Office on Saipan. So they're the folks, the archaeologists that are in charge of human remains. And I've had to do that. I've also worked with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, which is that agency that recovers lost service members. And so I've ran several projects with them as well. But there is definitely a process. We report it in the first instance. And then we go from there based on local, you know, authorities. But yeah, that's what happens. These are some of the underwater guides we created for the Underwater Heritage Trail that were on paper that could go underwater, and you can read about it. It's got the sites, and these are some of those posters from the Heritage Trail.
And for idiots like me, what exactly is an underwater trail? I mean, for people to go, to divers to travel from around the world and follow the instructions in advance that you've created, is as simple as that?
Yeah, totally. You can walk into a dive shop and hook up with a dive you know, operator, and they can take you out, or you can rent your own boat. You can even print these out online and laminate them and take them and go and dive. So it's got the coordinates, the GPS coordinates of where they are. It's kind of a choose your own adventure. So you could do all the sites in a day if you wanted to, or you can do, 3 a day until you're finished. And it's got tanks, assault vehicles, aircraft, ships, and landing vehicles. So there's a range of sites, both US and Japanese, on the trail.
Wow. Which is therefore a good time to ask Ian's question, which is about the wrecks being robbed or things being taken away, because that's an issue with ground archaeology, is that there's metal detecting on battlefields here in Europe, and people break things off bits of bunkers. So how does it work in terms of making sure people go down there and leave the sites as they find them?
Yeah, so some of the sites have been impacted by people who are collecting or looting, and we know that that's the case because we have photos from the 80s, and then we have photos now, and I've seen changes on the sites as well. I've seen people move stuff around and put them in piles. I've seen, things taken on sites. Some of the work that we did with the community was we ran free trainings for the dive shops and dive instructors and dive masters about heritage protection. And so, it's kind of like train the trainer, or, teach the teacher. So if you teach somebody that's taking people out, not to move stuff, not to touch it, not to sit in the cockpit chair that's going to fall apart when you bang your big tank in it, and show them the difference between a site that's been completely looted or had all kinds of problems, and show them another site that's less well known and more pristine and in better shape. You can literally show them the difference between use, because these are resources and they need to be utilized sustainably. So we've done a lot of outreach and education training, working with a lot of the managing agencies, from coral to historic preservation offices, to let them know these sites are out there and to keep an eye on them. They have a lot of law enforcement out on the water, who are working the sort of the environmental stuff. So we just have to remember about the historic stuff too.
And that's worth reminding ourselves that, of course, because the people who are watching this show, they are World War II buffs. So if they were going to Saipan, presumably most of them would be going there because they want to see where the landings took place. But there's the other type of visitor who are there for the diving. They're there for the visiting an island as something else. So the fact that you're working from the World War II preservation point of view, but also educating the divers about World War II, which isn't their primary thing, that's a great way of bringing these worlds together, because we always talk about it on this channel. It's bringing the various mediums together for the future, so that museum workers work alongside tour guides, who work alongside visitors, who in this case work alongside divers, so history is preserved correctly. Before we start playing the video, I want to just let this photo of yours about some of the gear you take down. So tell us about what tools you take underwater with you. Obviously, a simple thing of video cameras, but even that becomes complicated with water. So what type of gear do you take down there, and what results do you get from it?
Well, I mean, it can be pretty straightforward, like an underwater slate and mylar, underwater paper and pencil and a measuring tape. Or it can be as complicated as something like this that you're seeing. This is a 3D videography system that's capturing 2 sets of film that will then be overlaid to make a 3D film. We use cameras a lot. We do a lot of modeling, photogrammetry modeling, where we take lots of photos and make a 3D model so that we can look at how the sites are impacted over time. So that's one of the research questions I have about the use of these sites. And like I said, magnetometer or side scan. One of the really cool things we've been doing lately is testing eDNA. So taking sediment samples and water samples to see if there's human DNA on the sites, potentially from lost service members, but also eDNA related to fish, because this is, when you think about Saipan doesn't have a cash crop, it's not exporting anything. It relies on the oceans around it for tourism and food. And so, that kind of blue economy, we need to think about, what we can collect data on sites to look at fish, like what fish are on there, what's the diversity, is it healthy? So we Also utilize, we collect corrosion data to look at how long these sites are going to be around. So we take pneumatic drills down and drill in to test the original residual metal to see how long, if it's in an active or a passive state of corrosion. So we use a lot of different tools that you might use on land that are just adapted to use underwater.
No, and thank you for the answer. And you're talking about the fact there's rockets and ordnance down there. Is there also an issue, Ian is asking, of fluids? Because there's potentially dangerous chemicals in some of these vehicles as well, and relics, because of the operating system. So is that a hazard as well?
Yeah, so the U.S. within the shallower areas, I think the U.S. did a really good job of cleanup and pumping post-battle, and we see a lot of that in the deck logs and the records of, the vessels that were salvaging, like USS Clamp and others. I would imagine further offshore in deep water, where you have wrecks that you couldn't get to, that there is likely, oil and things like that, fuels that are still sort of in there. I mean, we know of wrecks like Arizona that's in Hawaii that's seeping constantly. So there is the potential, not necessarily within the lagoon, but probably on deeper water sites.
Okay, well, I think people are waiting for the video footage, so I'll start playing this. And I condensed some of the footage Jen sent me into a sort of a shorter set of four different dives here, but it's just amazing stuff. So kind of talk us about again what we're looking at and what can be learned. And I think particularly it's the idea of how our understanding of the battle can be shaped from this.
Yeah, so this is that LVT. This is US, not Japanese. It's the LVT that we know became the Marianas model. It's in shallow water, so 10 feet of water, you can practically stand on the top of it and stick your head up. But this is a beautiful little site that's you can take kids there and snorkel around. There's lionfish that live in it and all different kinds of species of fish that are around, and there's nice little corals. But this is the site that we spent about 2 weeks on, looking at, how did the U.S., figuring out why it's there first. Why is it there? What type is it? And then the questions, well, how was it? Was it modified? Was it, discarded? And so you can see up at the top that boilerplate around where the gun would have been. That if that wasn't there, there's just a guy sitting there sticking his head up, shooting, and then the 30 cal, you can see the 30 cal mount on the side, they added that extra gun. So it was all those kind of little details that, we wanted to look at and measure, but also kind of understand how the site is being preserved over time, how it's changing. We saw some changes. So in 2000 we mapped this in 2010, and then in 2015, Super Typhoon Sodalor came through, and it caused some problems on this site. So some of the tracks got broken because it's in shallower water, and some things were moved around. So it's also kind of understanding, how the environment impacts it. And what happens when we get more and more super typhoons related to the oceans warming and those kinds of things. So, just kind of tracking it. But this is a great, little dive site. You can snorkel around and look inside, and the fish are hanging out in there. I've taken lots of people out there to swim on this site, and it's in such a benign environment that it's a great little training site to even just do some basic diving skills, because it's in sandy water.
And I'm thinking that the when you're down there looking at these wrecks, it's the purity of what you're seeing there, because we know that vehicles, if they see continued action, as you said there, they get modified, they get repaired, they change it. So a vehicle that survives to 1945 may not be in the state it was in when it first appeared, wherever it appeared, in this case Saipan. So in this case, if you're going down to a wreck there, you can be certain that nothing has been added or changed since the moment it was launched or dumped after battle. And so I can understand where the information can come from. It's giving it the people who want to know about the detailed history, that micro detail that they definitely use the Mark III variant there, or the Mark VI, or whatever it would be, is that kind of information you can get from these wrecks.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other sites that we had to look at was a Daihatsu landing craft, Japanese Daihatsu landing craft. And we know that those are exactly where they're at whenever they went down, because we can match it to the actual skirmish that happened. There's three that are right nearby, and it's almost like he kind of dropped them in the ocean right near each other. And that was when the Japanese were trying to launch a counterattack from the seaplane base. And we have the documents of the U.S. seeing them and intercepting and sinking every single one of them. They were loaded with troops. And there's three that are right near each other, and we found another two within, a few hundred yards, so not very far away. And those can tell us about that event, what happened. And they haven't changed much because they're in a little bit deeper water. They're not in a channel, so they wouldn't have been, salvaged or needed to be moved by the U.S. when they were trying to clean up. Like I said, the only thing that we noticed with them over time is that one was damaged also by hurricane, or the super typhoon Solar as well. So those are the kinds of things that we kind of track and pay attention to.
So Scott Grimwood is asking about what is the deterioration rate of the wrecks, and for people like ourselves, who doesn't know about what I'm looking at in the sense of the growths and things there, is that going to deteriorate that wreck there? Is it helping preserve it? Sponges, corals? What's the process? What is going to be the dangerous thing to that in the future?
Yeah, so what you're kind of seeing is a calcium carbonate that survives and sort of grows on top of the wreck itself. And that acts as a protective layer on the iron. And so as long as that isn't disturbed regularly, or you don't, intercept with any kind of chemical or physical or biological, sort of impacts, then the sites kind of remain and sort of stay in a largely stable state. And so, that's what we look at when we are looking to take measurements. We basically drill through that calcium carbonate all the way to the residual metal, and we can use an electric probe type thing that gives us a reading that tells us whether it's an active or passive corrosion. Sometimes we'll drill through and it literally goes through the vehicle, which means that there's no residual metal left. On other sites, there is quite a bit. So it really depends on the quality of the material, of how it was, built, and what types of materials, the environment that it's in, and then what's impacting it over time. So we track all of that and collect all that physical, chemical, and biological information to know what's going on.
So this is the Avenger there. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the Avenger upside down. You can see the rocket just to the left, sticking in the wheel well. We identified this based on the shape of the aircraft and the wheel wells. We know Avengers, their wheels folded down into the wheel well. And, the general size. This one's in a great, it's right on the edge of the sort of coral reef. So it is kind of in a high impact zone in that, waves are crashing a little bit further out, but it has a lot of current that kind of runs through there. So I've been there holding on to that landing gear for dear life, as the current is ripping through when it's low or high tide. But it's also very peaceful, cool place whenever that you don't have those issues. This was a really neat site to study. I went to the archives and found the potential Avengers that were lost. Avengers were they had 3 crew, and so any loss has the potential for 3 people to have gone down. This one was flown by a guy named Boyce Holloman. He ended up becoming a senator in Mississippi, I think it was. He survived. He actually His two guys, he thinks they parachuted out. He can't remember, but they took anti-aircraft fire. The plane basically sort of started exploding and was on fire. And he tried to sort of land it on the reef, which is why the landing gear is down. He pulled himself out. He was burned. He sat on top of it and sat all night while he was being shot at by Japanese craft around him until a small surface craft could get to him and recover him. He was in the hospital for 6 months recovering from burns, and then came back to the U.S. and became a legislator and recorded his story. So sometimes it's really cool to like match these sites with the guys who were on them, you know, and kind of think about the sacrifices that, you know, the other two who are MIA, you know, the sort of ultimate sacrifice that they made during the battles. And
do we know at what point during the flight he was downed? Because if the rockets are still on it, David O'Keefe was asking earlier about the fact if the rockets are still on it, did it perhaps crash after takeoff or something? Because if it's coming back from mission, the rockets would have already been gone. So at what point during the flight do you think it happened?
Yeah, so the rockets, he may have still had some of the rockets in the wing. I know he was carrying a bomb load that he said that he had dropped his bomb load, but they carried bombs and they could carry up to 8 4-inch rockets. So they could have still had those attached to them. The also really weird thing about all these sites is that stuff ends up where it's not supposed to be too. So part of our job is figuring out whether or not things are original to a site or were they dumped or added later. I mean, there are sites out there that we know they came and just dumped stuff on top of because there was already something there and it was easy to discard of, you know, material of war in the same spot. So, so that's also part of kind of what we look at is what's that salvage process, what's that dumping process, and where we find sites.
Well, I'm really pleased. The viewers are really interested as well, not just in the World War II aspect, but they're interested in the environmental aspect as well. So, example of a question, Darren Little is asking, you know, the environmental damage done, and we're looking at footage like this. Is that helping preserve things? Is it harming? Is it just becoming part of nature now? Is it the equivalent of a coral reef? Tell us what, you know, how much damage this is doing, or if it's not doing damage, in fact.
Yeah, so these sites, we've had fish biologists come out on these sites. So I do a lot of interdisciplinary work and invite folks out. And so we had, in fact, I think in this little video clip, we have Ash Fowler, who was a PhD student at Sydney University. He came out and did fish counts and fish IDs for us. And so his study actually looked at whether or not these sites create more habitat for fish, or if they're, you know, if less, or if it's impacting it. So he took fish counts and fish IDs on the sites and nearby sites that weren't wrecks and determined that they did create a more, I guess, diverse environment for the biodiversity. So there were different types of fish or more fish, you know, different stages of fish in terms of juvenile and whatnot. So they can very well be, you know, beneficial to the environment. There, you know, we also have examples of where it's not, you know, where oil is leaking or munitions, like in Chook Lagoon, where it is problematic. So, yeah, we see both.
Wow, brilliant stuff. I'm just mesmerized by the footage. I mean, I saw it already when you sent it to me, but I'm still mesmerized by it. So to continue the theme of what we can learn from these wrecks, because I mean, amazing images. I mean, I can just imagine the fun, maybe isn't the right word, but the excitement you must have and the others going down diving on these amazing examples of history. But again, it's the results of archaeology. It's lots of field work is the fun bit, but then you've got to write all this stuff up. So tell us about some of the other conclusions and things you've drawn from these various dives, and how again we can understand the battle better because of it.
Yeah, so I feel like we learn things about the micro and the macro, you know, sort of like individual stories, like I've told you about the LVT and this Avenger. But we also learn sort of, you know, bigger picture things as well. So what happens after a battle is over, and what do the US do to a place that's then occupied? How do they how do they adapt that to use as a forward-facing base that they have had no, experience or contact with? And so we see that whenever we map underwater. So it's not even just these big sites, but also, there was a sea drone out there, a Japanese sea drone that had to be turned into a US sea drone. And it really doesn't take much, but we can find the anchors and the mooring blocks that are out there from the aircraft. We also find JATO rockets. They're jet-assisted rockets that would launch off of U.S. aircraft, seaplanes, and float planes that allow them to get extra lift to get off the water, and then they just drop them off like the Mariner, the PBM Mariner. So they drop them and they're all over the place, in the water. So that gives us more evidence of sort of use and where those, how that sort of sea drone was constructed and utilized. We also learn about salvage. Like I said, one of the sites on the Heritage Trail that we've worked on a lot is a Japanese sub chaser. We think we know if it's one or two, but when we first found the site, we only found half the site. We found the bow to about midship, and the whole stern was gone. It's like, it's so strange diving on a shipwreck and seeing half of it gone. As a maritime archaeologist, you expect to see the full thing. But we dug deeper into the records and then did more survey around and found out that, the salvage vessels were cutting it up and moving it because it was right near the channel. And they moved pieces to just across the channel, because when we dove on a salvage pile over there, we could match the building techniques of, the metal bits. Yeah, so this is Ash Fowler doing his fish work. So we could see, where they took things, where they dropped things as well. So kind of looking at post-battle as well is, equally as important, because as you said, when you see these sites, sometimes they're pristine, like they've been dropped there, like we would, nothing has changed. But in other ways, a lot has changed over time. We're talking about all kinds of impacts to those sites, have happened. And so just because we see a site as is doesn't mean necessarily that it is as it went down in the water.
I mean, you mentioned them, these 1,000 potential sites off Saipan. Another thing I'm thinking about also is how this is a representation of how, not wasteful isn't perhaps the right word, but whenever we talk about the Pacific Campaign, logistics is, of course, the big factor, because everything has to be taken huge distances. Drinking water has to be taken to Iwo Jima, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So given the fact people are saying that some of this stuff should have been salvaged, like the wheels on the Avenger may have been salvaged after time, things like that, the fact that so much stuff is down there still is that clearly there was a point where the U.S. Navy and U.S. military it was easier to issue a new thing than it was to go and get an old thing, which is just a fascinating insight into just how much stuff was being shipped by the U.S. and other countries to that theater.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to this point in the war, this was the largest amphibious invasion in Saipan, and so you're talking about 1,400 Amtraks that were with the 2nd and the 4th. And so it's a significant amount of material. And when, I imagine whenever something breaks down or you lose it or it's just disabled, you're still pushing forward and moving forward, and maybe you'll have time to go back and maybe you won't. And so there's lots of dump sites that are on land and underwater in Saipan. We haven't even sort of scratched the surface of dump sites. I know where some are that we have not been to yet, that we just haven't had the time to dive on. And when I say there's like 1,000 sites, that's over 1,000 hits. So like mag and side scan. So, some of those could be like a refrigerator,
Right, okay,
throw stuff in the water. But, I mean, when you're talking about us diving out there for 2 weeks and finding 9 sites that's a lot. We went out a few years ago and dove on more targets and found even more sites. So that we haven't put on the trail. We've just been trying to, identify where things are, but there is a ton out there.
Yeah, and I'm now thinking about all the other potential places that could be dived as well. There's the Guadalcanal, all the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, all those things there. Because again, this idea of people, we had Philip Bradley on Sunday talking about going across New Guinea on the ground. But again, there's all the Milne Bay area there in New Guinea, that there's incredible air battles out there as well. So presumably it's not something many people do, because it needs lots of funding, because you've got to take lots of gear there and you've got to have specialist people involved there. So where are you in terms, how many people in the world are doing this? Basically is my question.
Well, so we teach maritime archaeology here at East Carolina University. There's really sort of 3 programs in the U.S. that teach maritime archaeology. And the UK has some good ones at Southampton, and there's quite a few over sort of the Europe and Mediterranean area. There's one at Flinders University in Australia, where I used to teach. But it is a small, it's a small sort of cottage, industry in terms of maritime archaeologists. But when you think about it, any U.S. federal dollar that's going to be spent in an area, there has to be a survey that's conducted to make sure that there aren't any historic properties on land or underwater. So there is a need for that in the private industry. So we're training sort of the next generation of folks who are going to go out and get their jobs with state agencies or private organizations, companies, also like the National Oceanographic Administration, NOAA, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Anytime you're going to lay a pipeline, guess what? There's probably something there, So there's a need for it, because people think, the ocean is out of sight and out of mind. But there is a lot of stuff still out there. So in terms of folks working in the Pacific, there's a handful of us. A lot of it is related to World War II, is tied to the DPAA mission, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. So I've worked with them quite a bit over the last several years. They're looking for aircraft and lost service members. And then, there's a handful of sort of archaeologists and researchers like myself who are interested in this time period, but also working with communities to kind of preserve and conserve the things that they have. This is the Emily, which is a super cool site. It is unbelievable. All 4 propellers. So the Emily was a seaplane bomber. All 4 of the propellers are there. We know that it was shot on takeoff because 2 of the propellers are bent and 2 are not. And we know that the Emily would start 2 engines on takeoff, and then once they were in air would start the other 2. So having 2 bent and 2 straight, because when propellers hit the water, they bend. And it's right in the Seadrome. So this is a really cool site because it still has the gun turret, like one of the gun turrets with a gun sticking up in it that you can sit. There's also the cockpit and the controls and the chair that are still there. Those were the kinds of things that I was, we were training sort of the dive instructors and dive masters not to have their divers sit in the chair and take a picture, although it's super cool, sit behind it and take it, because every time they sit their fat tank in it, heavy fat metal tank, pieces of it, break away. And then pretty soon we only have the outline of that chair. Back in the background, you can see a piece of aluminum that has the gray and red paint on it. Up in the top right hand side. Now it's sort of down on the bottom, but yeah, you can still see the camouflage paint on this plane.
And just a simple thing like that, the fact that what color it was painted, because there is basically very, very little Japanese stuff surviving from World War II. We have way more Allied gear than we have Japanese gear from World War II. So, every time you see a Zero flying an air show, it's usually a fake one. It's not a real one, as we know. So the fact you can actually go and look again, it's the fact it's in its original state there. You can go down there and identify what color it was, or what unit was using a particular type of a model or a particular color there. And this is the kind of information that I think is absolutely extraordinary. We had another question come in because you mentioned your university there, just going away from World War II. Didn't the same university find the Queen Anne's Revenge too, Blackbird's pirate ship? I believe that is you, isn't it?
Yeah, so it was found by some surveyors, some folks who were looking for it, and then the state started investigating it. But the conservation lab is actually on our campus. We share a space with QAR. So if you ever come to Greenville, North Carolina, you can take a tour and see all the cannon and anchors and artifacts from that site. And we've had some joint projects where a lot of our faculty and staff have worked on that site.
It's just amazing for this footage is extraordinary. So, I mean, when were you last underwater looking at cool stuff like this?
So I was there earlier this spring. So we had a little bit of a pandemic shutdown, but we got out there in spring, in February, March, and we're excavating a Hellcat for a DPAA mission to try and recover the pilot who went down on that aircraft. So I'm working with a group of Special Forces veterans that I've partnered with, and I train them in underwater archaeology and excavation. And then they go out with me out to the Pacific with a crew of us, and they get an opportunity to, be involved in one of those missions, which is super cool because it has a lot of meaning for them in terms of not leaving a soldier behind and having a mission and a new purpose and focus. And so we've been doing that for the last several years with Task Force Dagger Foundation. They're a nonprofit special forces group that supports SOF veterans and active SOF service members and families.
I mean, again, you sent me the information on that earlier on. You are juggling lots of balls with this because, as we've established, you're interested in the World War II wrecks for their own historical value. There's the fish count aspect that people are doing as well. There's the climate change aspect. I suppose we could talk about that as well. There's what's happening to corals and reefs. There's the sustainable industry of tourism with the trails there, and there's also looking for missing personnel from World War II, and there's taking former service personnel out there as part of their process of all the many things that's involved there. So you're keeping a lot of balls in the air with this.
Yeah, it's, I've been pretty lucky. I feel like very fortunate that this is a place, a community that has, sort of accepted me and supported me and the ideas that I bring to them. And they also bring ideas to me. So I've been derailed with different things. If you would have told me 20 years ago that I'd been working on World War II aircraft and metal shipwrecks, I would have told you to get lost because I was interested in Spanish wooden early shipwrecks. But, the history and the sites are just so amazing. And I think when you engage in research in an area where the community appreciates what you're doing and they also contribute in significant ways to that, and you have a lot of people that are happy to kind of, collaborate and do interdisciplinary research, you're just lucky. It's really nice to be able to take lots of different folks out there and also listen to what they need, so sometimes I'm doing projects that aren't even related to this, because it's something that, the community needs done or wants to see done. So I've been lucky, I feel like. And so I've been working out there. My first trip out was 2007. So it's been a journey. It's been a ride.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing stuff. And again, I'm thinking about the potential benefits of information here because, again, I always come back to normally that's where I live. I mean, we know that they're intended landing sites. In many cases, units were swept down the beach, up the beach because of tide conditions, because of this, that, and the other. And so, of course, anybody reading a book, let's take Saipan, for example. I've had guests talking about landings there. They're going by the information that was recorded by surface vessels and troops landing on the beaches there. But I'm assuming that there's a potential for undersea sites to say, actually, it turns out they probably landed about 1,000 yards left of where we thought they landed, because this is where the evidence is. Is that the kind of thing that this work could do?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like a forensic archaeology
Yeah.
where you're sort of piecing together the evidence. So, the Sherman tanks that are just offshore and the LVTs that are just offshore, we're studying those carefully to determine which unit they were belonged to and which people were on it. Which crew was on it. So, those are the kinds of things that we look at. That's some of the really cool camouflage. We're going offshore. I'm super excited about this coming year. In April, we're going to go into the deeper waters where the staging happened. So when they staged offshore, the U.S. actually created a seadrome offshore in deeper waters, and then had all the surface vessels out there. And so we're using LIDAR to try and to determine where sites are. So we're looking up to 50 meters of water. That's that gun turret with the Japanese gun in it. And so we're going out with a big team to look for new sites that are in deeper water that maybe we can add some to the heritage trail, but just know what's out there. So we know a PBM Mariner was lost out there, which was the same PBM Mariners that first spotted the Japanese fleet that led to the Marianas turkey shoot. That's kind of a cool connection to bigger sort of history, a battle. We're looking offshore too, which is going to be really exciting. And we're going to collect eDNA for biodiversity. We're going to collect photogrammetric models of the site, and more corrosion data to look and see what's deeper out there. Because so far, I mean, I could spend hundreds of years inside this lagoon, on sites, but it's time to kind of turn out and see what's further out.
Amazing stuff. And David O'Keefe, who himself has done some diving and Bermuda Triangle and Challenger space shuttle information, but he's asking, what is the most startling or stark discovery you have made off of Saipan? One discovery that made you think about things in a completely different direction.
That's a good question about direction. I don't know. I mean, I think one of the really cool sites that isn't on the Heritage Trail is a Coronado, and that site is pretty remarkable because it's not well known, and so it's in really good condition. Although it is heavily broken up because it was they pulled the people out of it after it crashed. So parts of it were kind of pulled. There's the chair. You can see the cockpit and the chair and the gauges. But that side is like, when you dive on it, it's almost like stepping back in time because you can see the windshield and the windshield wipers, like the rubber is still on it. There's a pile of U.S. Navy forks that are, there, all the gauges. And every time I dive on that side, I just think to myself, this is not that long ago, and it definitely feels like, pretty real. Like, it's not that far of a step back in time on that site, because a lot of the elements are still there. And when I think about that site and I think about, other sites that have been dived heavily or impacted, I get to see the difference between what happens when you don't know about a site or when people don't know about a site, and what happens when a lot of people are using that site. So I think we have a ways to go to educate folks about how
And talking about educating folks, I'm thinking about educating historians as well, because one of the things us middle-aged guys are guilty of is approaching things the same way we've always approached things, by going to the archives, reading after-action reports, reading morning reports, war diaries, and walking the ground on the surface, we said at the beginning. I'm assuming there's a generation of people who perhaps just don't even know what can be achieved by the type of work you're doing, and that it's educating people within the field of history as well about what can be learned from under the water.
Yeah, part of what we try and do is to bring this stuff to life to people who are non-divers,
Yeah.
so making that 2D and 3D film. We made that 3D film, and that can be shown on, in the theater at the national park on Saipan for people who have no idea what's out there or what's underwater, and then maybe they'll get excited about it and go and snorkel or get a charter or swim out to the tanks. So reaching non-divers is important. We also worked with a school teacher who got School Teacher of the Year in Colorado. We gave him all the data, and he created a 3D immersive museum with his school kids students, his high schoolers. So they built their own 3D museum. And so those are the kinds of things that I think are really exciting, is when, school kids or non-divers or, people who don't even know that this stuff is out there or can't access it can actually can understand that history and know that there's stuff underwater as well as what they're seeing, on shore or on land.
Yeah, no, just amazing footage again. And I can see just how many people are involved in this opera. There's what, 6, 7 of you down there at the time or something?
Yeah, so this is a bunch of our graduate students, and you can see the little black things. You're wondering what those black things are hanging off the back of them. When I was teaching in Australia, we had to wear shark shields. These emit like an electrical pulse just because of the great whites. And it was part of our diving manual, which was really ridiculous that we had to wear them. So when I went to Saipan, they were like, you have to wear these. And I was like, there's no great whites out here. I mean, maybe a tiger shark or something, but yeah, so these are all graduate students from Flinders University when we started mapping the sites. So there could be, 10 to 12 divers down there mapping these sites because they are pretty massive. We have to stretch a big tape, and that was even before we started using cameras and using photogrammetry. Sometimes it would take us, this site would take us a week to map by hand, but now we can go down in 30 minutes and use a camera and do a photogrammetric survey and come up with a 3D model in like 24 hours, which is mind-blowing to me because it hasn't been that long between that time and this time. So it's kind of crazy how quickly technology has come, how fast it has come. This is one of the Japanese Daihatsu landing craft that I was talking about. We're in that sort of counterattack. A small little wreck. There's like a little shield, basically a metal shield and a little eye hole, that the driver would stand behind. And this would have been loaded with troops on its way to counterattack the U.S. whenever it was sunk. And this site, you can swim to another site. It's less than 50 meters away. So you can dive this site and another site that's right nearby. You just take a compass bearing and swim off into the big blue and see it.
So David's asking another question there. Can you explain the concept of photogrammetry? I hope I've pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So photogrammetry is just the process of taking multiple photos from different angles. So we would swim around in like a pattern and swim around and get multiple angles of a site. And then you feed them into a program. There's a few different programs. Sometimes there are some free programs, but we use Metashape. And you feed it into a program, and it actually develops a 3D model. So if you do a little search, Sketchfab is the website. If you go on Sketchfab and you search for me or Saipan shipwrecks or something like that, you can see the models and you can look at them and turn them. And because you use you scale them. So we use scales to make sure that we know the size of things, because we scale them, and we can actually take measurements. They're, millimeter worth of accuracy underwater as well. So we can take measurements. And then we can take models from, say, 2012, which we did, and models that I'm going to do next year, and we can compare them, and we can look at our 2012 models. I have models from 2012, 2017, and then we're getting some next year. I have 15 years worth of models that I can then overlay and use kind of like a heat mapping software that will show me the difference between the sites and how they've changed over time.
Wow.
So, that's really cool too, because there's not a lot of places other than probably that I know of, the USS Arizona, that they're getting that kind of longevity of data over time. So we've got.
No, I mean, amazing. I mean, another thing I'm thinking about is the fact that I'm presuming that when you were starting this process, what, sort of 15, 20 years ago, is you had to almost write the manual of how to interpret this information, because there were teams looking at the battlefields on the ground back in World War II. They were looking at, they'd go and look at all the tanks on the battlefield and say, this one was hit by a rocket from the air, this one was hit by a tank destroyer fire. So we've got 80 years of data of that. But for this, to understand what happens when, for example, an Emily transport goes into the water and crashes, you're having to kind of write the manuals as you go along, because I presume there isn't that much data you can draw on of past dives.
Yeah, it's kind of cool because underwater aircraft archaeology or aviation archaeology is more new. It's a newer field. Like, I studied shipwrecks, wooden shipwrecks, and so I had to sort of teach myself aircraft construction and understand aircraft crash investigation, like what happens whenever aircraft crash. Why are the propellers bent? Why do you get engines that are whole or busted up? If it's a high velocity impact and it was on fire and it hits the water, the engines can explode. And you find parts of engines. So a lot of it has been and continues to be sort of learning as I go. And kind of sharing that information with other folks who are interested in it. And, just because I've worked on so many, maybe a dozen aircraft now, I'm really starting to feel like I'm getting a picture of, what happens when an air crash crashes.
We're glad on the channel we've got the world's leading expert in this. So Jeff is asking about, you were talking about moving out to staging areas. If you move out to the Philippines Sea, anything in particular you'll be looking for?
Yeah, so we're going to be looking in the staging area. So we do know that some surface craft went down from just Japanese fire. We do know a PBM Mariner went down. We'll also be looking for how those how that offshore sea drone was created, because that was the first instance of an offshore forward-facing sea drone that was created, and that was a crazy idea, because to lay that out in deep water where the waves are big, there's some significant current, and they're taking fire from the Japanese constantly, but they pushed forward on that to set those up, because those PBM Mariners were the ones that were scouting, looking for subs, and the surface, the Japanese Navy. And so it was a necessity. It wasn't a great idea, but it was an absolute necessity. So that's some of the stuff that we're going to be looking for. We do notice a Japanese submarine, a midget sub, could potentially be out there. So really, we're looking for what's out there. Sometimes it's hidden in the archives, and it can take as much time to look for it in the archives as it can to just go out there and run a mag or a side scan, or look at existing LiDAR data. So we have LiDAR data that NOAA collected, and we're processing that using really cool AI, artificial intelligence, like getting a computer to recognize sites, and then we'll go and test whether or not that site. So that's another technology we're using that isn't well known, and it's kind of like we're testing it. Can we find sites using LiDAR? Because we know we can find them on land. All those jungle sites in the Mayan that they've been finding with LiDAR, but can we find them underwater using LiDAR, and what are the specifications of that?
Wow, amazing stuff. Another question from David, who is hogging the questions there, but he has a bit of experience. Is what is the one piece or wreck that you have found that stays with you, one that remains a treasure for you, no pun intended?
I think finding personal stuff, like shoe leather, like the bottoms of shoes. For me, really kind of drives home that there were guys on these that didn't survive. I think when I find personalized things like a shoe on one of the wrecks, that is incredibly, significant in terms of just like knowing that people are there. Because I'm an anthropologist, which studies people, and an archaeologist, and so I can get enamored by all the cool technology and equipment and all the machines of war and all that kind of stuff, but I'm brought home and reminded of why I'm doing this whenever I see those personal objects. I think it reminds me to like take a step back, think about what it is that I'm looking at and what story that tells. So I think seeing that like one of the shoes for the first time, I was like, wow, okay, dudes were here.
Yeah.
They went down on this, and I'm not sure if the guy who was wearing the shoe survived or not.
No, definitely. And History Underground, that's JD, and from his channel, there's asking any plans to explore other sites outside of the Mariana.
Yeah, so I've worked in like I think I mentioned before, I worked in Palau, and we surveyed we did the first underwater survey of Peleliu, which is super cool.
Wow.
And I'd love to go back. And I've also worked in Hawaii, off Maui, on some aircraft that are out there. I get invitations to come out to different places, and so sometimes I'm able to take people up on it, and other times I have to ask them to swing back around and invite me again because I've already got something going on. So the Solomons or Papua New Guinea would be a place that I've been invited that I haven't been able to get out to yet, but one of these days it's going to happen. I've got a project off the coast of Queensland in Australia looking for another aircraft next year. So the Pacific is mostly where I've been working lately, and up and down sort of the islands of the Marianas too.
Well, it's because Pat from Ireland asked if you wanted to come over and do a dive off Donegal. There's Shermans and things like that. But I think the footage off the coast of Donegal in the Irish Sea will be slightly less pretty than the footage we're looking at today. But no less interesting, but slightly grayer, I would imagine.
I'm 100% behind low vis diving too. I mean, we live in Eastern North Carolina, so a lot of our field schools happen in the rivers here, which is crazy. It's just great that I get to go here. We were just in Antigua a few months ago running a field school, and I was excavating in zero visibility on a French shipwreck, from the 18th century. So, but literally zero visibility. So
wow.
I have done the archaeology by feel.
Wow, it's funny. We have two questions that I'm gonna read them together because it's interesting. They came one after the other. So Andreas is asking, did Jennifer find any gold in the old Spanish ships? And Phil is asking, how much does it cost Jenny to do this stuff? So I'm wondering whether one leads to the other. You found some gold that enables you to do more. I'm joking.
No. I get that question a lot, and I always say, because I have to say, I'm an archaeologist, so I have to say the real treasure is in the history of our past, right? So no, I've never found gold or silver on any of the Spanish shipwrecks, and that's not without trying to find the artifacts that I'm looking for, but I found a lot of really cool other stuff on Spanish shipwrecks. So but yeah, we developed a maritime heritage trail down in the Keys called the Galleon Trail. So you can go and dive on the 1733 Spanish shipwrecks down there. But the trick is they've already been looted.
Okay. So
they were first salvaged by the Spanish for many years. In fact, they salvaged so much off of them that it actually outmatched the original records. And so that meant that the Spanish were actually bringing things on illegally. So a lot of the sailors would pack away stuff. So that was kind of interesting. What does it cost? So I apply for a lot of grants. I apply through the National Park Service or NOAA. I have applied to the National Endowment for Humanities. And so my projects have pretty much ranged from about, you know, $15,000 all the way up to $500,000, depending on how much, you know, work we're doing, which is also great because it brings the community money. So anytime we're working in Saipan, I'm paying for hotels and food and, you know, cars. And so I don't source money on island. I source money elsewhere and bring it to the island, which makes me also feel a little bit better about what I'm doing. We hire local historians and guides to go into the field. So when I go on a trip, I've done a lot of sites on land as well. So we've recorded cave sites and things like that. But we usually hire local enthusiasts and spelunkers and folks that know the history on land too to go with us, which is a ton of fun because I've seen some really cool sites on land.
We kind of covered this question at the beginning, but I would do it again. Bruce Day is asking about the potential of unexploded ordnance. Do you have someone in the dive team with that kind of experience?
Yeah, so lately I have, because I've been working with Special Forces veterans and that some of them have that experience. But prior to that, no, it's just been a matter of being able to identify it. So I've done a lot of research looking at what the potential is for objects. And trying to identify them because I have to kind of put it in a, with diving, there's always, and universities, there's always those risk assessments that you have to do. And so that's part of it for sure.
Willie Robertson is asking, which are the most inquisitive fish, or which are the fish that are the World War II history buffs? Is there a particular species that is fascinated by Avengers, for example?
I don't know, but I will tell you that I've got a good little friend. He lives on the Avenger, which is the wreck that's out on the reef, and he's a moray eel. And I've seen him grow. So I've been going out there for 15 years, and I saw him the first time I went down on it, and I see him every year that I go out there. And so that's kind of cool. Like we're buddies, you know, I mean, I would never stick my hand in his mouth for sure, but you know, it's kind of cool to see that same, and we know that like eels in terms of their structure and habitat that they stay where they're at. So I know it's the same one.
It's fascinating. There's a moray eel protecting a TBM Avenger site and living in it. It's extraordinary. It brings us back this idea of these merging of these worlds. There's the historical interest, but there's also these wrecks you're diving on. They are now communities for all these wonderful fish that we're seeing on the screen now. It's amazing. It's extraordinary. Another question: have you ever dived on any Civil War wrecks? Okay, that's Jeff asking that question.
Yeah, I have. So I've spent some time on Civil War wrecks. We were trying to find one. I actually am from Florida, and so my family lives in Steenhatchee, Florida, which is on the Gulf Coast of the U.S. And so that was an area of the Civil War that was really active with blockade runners and whatnot. And so we were looking for a Civil War wreck that was just offshore there. And so we did a lot of survey. And we dove on a boiler that potentially could be associated. It's really low visibility, so we need to go check it out a little bit more. But yeah, I've been on Civil War sites in Florida, and well, you know what? I did dive one off the North Carolina coast as well. So they're all around. We have some great ones just offshore.
It seems that everything people ask you, you've done it. We did have a question I can't find now about diving. There we are. Tim Sampson asking, have you dived any of the U-boats off the North Carolina coast?
I haven't. I moved here to Greenville in 2013 from Australia. And so a lot of the diving I've been doing has been in the Pacific. So I haven't had a lot of time to dive the sites offshore, but I would love to. We have faculty here that have been involved in the mapping of the U-boats and the finding of the U-boats. So Dr. Nathan Richards is my colleague, and he's worked extensively with folks from NOAA on the Battle of the Atlantic.
Brilliant stuff. So my final question, because we will bring things to an end fairly soon, is kind of what next and what would you like to see? I mean, I could guess like me, you'd like to see as much collaboration as possible between the various fields of history. So the people who spend their time in the archives, the battlefield buffs, the aviation enthusiasts, the people who understand the tech. Well, you'd like to see more of that, people coming together and people coming to you from different fields. That would be brilliant, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really what's exciting to me, because I've been working out there for so long. I'm constantly kind of looking at ways in which I can engage like other researchers or even other community partners too, because I know these sites well enough that if somebody has a question or wants to do something out there, I can lead them to it. You know, I can show them the sites, I can help them get the funding. I can, you know, part of the reason why we did the eDNA study with DPAA to look to see if there were, lost service members off the site is because we can help DPAA increase their sort of efficiency of their mission in recovering. So imagine if I spend 3 seasons excavating a aircraft to see if there was one pilot on it, or I could send a team down to collect sediment and water samples and process that eDNA and tell you whether or not that guy is even on that aircraft.
Wow.
The like potential for new technologies is just amazing.
Well, I mean, I think that's everybody's takeaway, is that you are absolutely spearheading the way with technology. And I think there are some researchers and military historians watching this thinking, damn, she gets to use some really cool tools. And those of us who spend our time solely, and I don't, I'm doing this all the time, but those like David O'Keefe, who spends time in the archives, there's so many other ways of getting information. And you've shed light on this incredible world of yours. So, well, I can't wait to invite you back, because I feel we've only begun to tap into the information in your head and the experience you've been through. And I would love to have you back in the future and perhaps be part of a panel discussion about Saipan, because there's Stephen McLeod who wrote about forces landing there, and maybe discuss what's being learned about these battlefields from different methods. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, cool. Well, I appreciate it. It's been a ton of fun, and I love what you got going on here. It's super cool to see all the different types of research and folks that you've been having on. So I'd be happy to come back and also make some recommendations for other.
No, definitely. We need more cool people. We have plenty of middle-aged male white historians. We've got them coming out of our ears, myself being one of them. What we need is cool people from different fields to bring us this World War II from different angles. That's everything we're about on this channel, because there's so many ways of studying the past, and what you're doing is absolutely incredible. So people have loved it. It's been really great talking to you, and if you've impressed the great David O'Keefe, then that's good, because yeah, well done, David. So it's been fantastic.
Cool. Yes, that's awesome.
So we'll leave things there. So I'll just take you off screen for a second to remind people what we've got coming up tomorrow, and I'll bring you back for a second. So folks, tomorrow evening we're carrying on with James Zobel is coming on talking about MacArthur's Papua New Guinea campaign. That'll be fantastic. He works at the MacArthur Institute. Then on Wednesday we have Andy Chatterton coming on about the stay-at-homes, the Churchill's special secret force in Britain. He did one show with we back in the early days of World War II TV, but since then he's done his book. So Andy's going to be back on there talking about that. Then we've got a show on Thursday about Wake Island that I've just scheduled today, and then I'm working on my Eastern Front 2 weeks in the new year. As always, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to click the little bell to get the notifications. All the information you need is in the description below. There's information to some of Jennifer's work is in that description below, and the underwater trail, it's all there. You can go and examine that later on. But I'm going to bring Jennifer back in to say it's been great talking to you. You are definitely the coolest guest I've had for a long time. So you have that. You're at the top of the cool charts right now.
Awesome.
It's your position to lose now. You're there in pole position.
I look forward to it.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodad for World War II TV saying I'll see you all again tomorrow. Cheers. Bye.